So we're in your economy book and we're in chapter 14 and we're going to be doing, I think this will be the last video if we get it all in here. And congratulations, we're going to be done with our economics class. Yay! So this section is chapter 14. Section 2 is called Killing the Goose That Lays the Golden Eggs. Let's think about killing the goose. A goose is laying golden eggs to provide for us, and we decide that we want to kill him and eat him maybe, or see what makes him lay those eggs, and then we have no more golden eggs. And that's what it's describing. If we want to kill capitalism, our free enterprise society, if we want to kill the goose that's giving us the golden eggs, we're not going to have any more, are we? We're not going to have any more prosperity. That's what this section is about. So it starts with political and moral errors can ruin even a thriving economy. So if we have we lacked sound policy, but we also lack our moral leadership, we're going to end up going into recession. We're going to be going away from prosperity. And the examples here they give are in Rome in the 5th century, or Spain in the late 16th century, or France in the 18th century. All of these countries, their leadership had ungodly rulers and went away from God. In Rome, we see in the 5th century, in the midst of the Rome falling, coming in and being taken over by barbarians in the midst. We know from the Caesars on to even the advanced Roman Empire how ungodly they were. They fell. Spain, the same way. France, we think of the French Revolution, what happened there, very ungodly, standing against God in every way, and they fell. And in Latin America, even in the 20th century, a lot of communist rulers and such that claimed not to be godly in any way, and very evil, drugs and cartels and everything, and all of their countries, all of their economies falling. So we see in these areas many recessions and unwise economic policies in these countries. So we can look at history. These are not just the only countries, many, and it could happen in America too. So in understanding a little about economics, we understand that the demands, basically the demands for an industry. First, we have industries, we have commerce, we have agriculture, and they're doing producing, and they have to deal with labor unions and political actions, politics, the general public need. They have to basically, the demands are high on business. So there has to be a balance between the business, and the demands of the people, and also, in their business, what they're required to pay out to the government, right? So if the demands are too high for industry, commerce, and agriculture, and the government will have to take over, we're going to fall into a recession. This is basically what we've been going through. Here, let's look at this picture here. It says, many prosperous economies have been ruined through unwise choices made by both the private and public sectors. So you see that picture there. So let's go on to this. This is this quote here. Managing one's own life is complex enough. Managing the lives of others is impossible. So leave each to his own choosing, so long as he does not infringe upon the rights of his fellow man. This is the whole case for the free market. The free market is basically, as you can see, saying, we have to manage our own lives first, and then we can help manage the lives of the other, but that's impossible only through God, right? But it's basically saying, the free market is we're not going to be letting the government manage us totally. But anyway, you can read that over again. That's by Leonard E. Read. So, during the 1970s, as an instance we're talking about here, I'm just going to go over this quickly. So in the 1970s, there was before the 1970s, I should say, there was an increase in productivity, an increase in the population in the 1950s and 1960s after World War II. And then it slowed down in the 1970s. And this slowing down was like we thought as what was happening in the industry. In fact, it says here, the marvelous American economy was not behaving as wonderfully as it had once done at this point. The industry and the agriculture and the commerce started to fall. Prices started to increase. Interest rates started to increase. Unemployment was increasing. Government expenditures increasing. And, and the points of looking at it, it said, you thought, well, the vigor had gone out of American productivity. So what happened? Well, in your book here, it talks about a certain company. They take an imaginary company, really, but it's a company that is comparable to what was happening in the 1970s. And this company was called Gray Iron Fabricating Company of Mont Maine, Michigan. So this is our company. The president is Herbert McCullough, and he has put this company together since 1921. In World War II, it was a very admirable company and producing a lot of stocks and large dividends, doing really well, had excellent credit at the banks, and was known as a great company in iron fabrication. Then in 1967, something happened. Two strong labor unions came in, and the National Labor Relations, NLRB, said that he needed to pay a lot more wages. And so he ended up having to pay high hourly wages. He even looked and thought, he was paying one of the highest wages in the whole world at that time. Well, his competitors actually started to buy goods from Japan that were their goods to produce certain things. And so his competitors actually were being able to put prices down, and so he wasn't getting or selling the goods like he should. And so he needed equipment capital was needed to be replaced because he had old machinery. He needed new machinery. He needed to update, to keep going. And he could no longer pay high dividends to their stockholders anymore. So McCullough, he basically he had to decrease his own salary and not take much of his salary. And he also had to decrease any of his executives' salary and let some of them go. His orders started to diminish, and he had to lay off, 40 employees from his foundry. So, and on to that, he had his payments. He had to basically make payments to the Employment Security Commission in Michigan. So he had, because of laying off his employees. So basically that too cost him. Then he was having trouble with OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health. Their rules. The OSHA guy came in basically saying that his equipment was less than safe. And so he ended up having to redo his, advance his equipment, make sure everything was safe, but also he had to pay some fines from the past, so he had to put out some money there. He also had a lawsuit from a female junior executive that said that he promoted a young man instead of her, and then basically charging he had to get a lawyer to defend, saying that there was discrimination. So then he went on, there was an accident where a worker was ignored the safety hazards that were in working, and he fell and he was actually electrocuted. So then he had to pay out, $3 million in damages, and this appealed to the higher courts, and he had to pay more lawyers. His payments on the banks, their payment on the banks now, they could only pay a small amount of the principal, and they had to actually borrow more money. So now looking, the company still, it looked like it was a nice company, tightly outward and everything, but he was worn out. Herbert McCullough was worn out, and his wife wanted to just sell out and move to Florida. She was like This was the end. This was the end. They thought, you know, more, more actually than she could handle. And so in 1995, he showed a loss, and the loss was getting more and more in his company, but he still turned out some steel. So the financial situation was really frightening. When he looked at his business cost and everything, he was like, just appalled, like, oh, what am I going to do? And so on the chart, so here, let's look at this picture right here. This is telling his whole thing. No, Mr. Pod, we cannot assume that your farmlands have any common sense whatsoever. Now let's see. Failure to warn employees about staring at the sun, inadequate supply of moisturizing sunscreen, non-compliance with OSHA, regulations for safe hoeing. So the business are like, oh, I have to do all these things or I'm going to get fines. And indeed, many have. So here he went. So we're talking about McCullough now. So we're talking about, he's looking and he's discouraged and is getting more discouraged, thinking, how can I keep my business going? And so he has a conference with his chief stockholders to find out. But before this, he looks at the obligations that he has to do now, his laws and regulations. He says, okay, these are common now. Federal and state unemployment insurance, he has to pay that. Workman's compensation insurance, he has to pay that. Medical and dental insurance, he has to pay that. Payments to the union pension fund, he has to pay that. Vacation pay for employees, he has to pay that. Social Security payments. Affirmative action measures to hire more minority employees. Improvements demanded by OSHA, safety. Wages for security guards to protect the plant and employees against vandalism and crime. Sudden 30% increase of foundries' property taxes have increased. All these things, they have to be concerned with now. So at this point, here's his choices. So he sits down and thinks, okay, what are my choices? What am I going to do now? So his choices, McCullough's choices are, number one, he can borrow $5 million from banks. Even though the firm would be charged high interest rate, he could borrow some more money, like $5 million. And then he can enlarge and modernize the foundry and hire a larger sales force and produce more income. He can do that. He can borrow more money. Number two, he can terminate the firm's contracts with the unions. So he can basically say, okay, I'm not going to have contracts with the unions, and this might mean what? That they're going to strike, right? So he can deal with the unions, and that can be a problem, or he can terminate their contracts. So that means that he'll have to pay his employees not as many things, So, but knowing that probably won't work because there'll probably be a strike or there's going to be problems. Number three, he can sell gray iron fabricated to a large corporation. So he can just say, okay, I'm going to sell this. And accept the stock of the bigger corporation as payment, so he can sell out to a bigger corporation and give them a monopoly on just sell it to them. Or number four, he can go out of business. He can sell his site and his buildings, which for some he may get, and then he can retire in St. Augustine, Florida, and live off his savings. So he can just get out of business. Or number five, he can continue operations by outsourcing his production to a cheaper labor location, like saying, okay, we're going to move part of our production to Mexico so that we can produce it in Mexico cheaper, and then we can distribute it here. So he can do all these things. A lot of times, a lot of business will have to go out of business. So this whole thing, this is common with a lot of the companies since the 1970s. So here's another picture here we have. See this guy here? He says, today Congress passed a bill that increases federal sales tax in order to fund a 5-year, $300 billion study on the increase of businesses and individuals declaring bankruptcy. So you can see, so today he has to think, if I could declare bankruptcy, man, and he's looking at all his stuff, all his things that he has gathered for his business to get rid of, to declare bankruptcy. So stagflation, remember stagflation, inflation with unemployment and stuff in the 1970s did end because of tax breaks in the 1980s. But the government continues to try to manage things best, and it's best managed by the private sector, because the government tends to heavily tax, forced to pay high wages, innumerable government regulations, deprived of capital that's needed capital, cause higher prices, and foreign competitors are more likely to capture the markets by offering lower prices. All of these things happened in the midst, and we can see that picture as we went through Mr. McCullough's business, right? So we have a quote here by Ronald Reagan. It says, "The founding fathers knew a government can't control the economy without controlling people. And they knew when a government set out to do that, it must use force and coercion to achieve its purpose. So we have come to a time for choosing." So the founding fathers knew that we can't control the economy without controlling people. So we can't control the economy. We'll take away the people's freedoms. And so now, if we do, he's saying if you do, then you're going to have to use force. And that's what happens in communist socialistic economies. So now we're going to talk about here, and this is killing the goose that lays the golden eggs. So we're going back to this. So the resources of even the largest industrial and commercial firms are limited. And so these pressures that I've talked about, placed on business by public authorities and other groups, may remind you of a fable of the goose that laid the golden eggs. So in some of the many versions, the story is a bird that is owned by a woman or a man rather than a couple, but in all the versions, the moral is basically the same. Greed consumes the source of prosperity. So here is the little story, so the goose that lays the golden eggs. So maybe shall I read it? The phenomenon had been going on for several weeks. Yes, the goose actually laid golden eggs, huge nuggets, smooth as wax and heavy as lead. The man and his wife went down on their knees and thanked Hermes for having so rewarded their years of poverty and piety. "But we could do with a bigger house," said the wife. "Of course," the man replied, and after a few days and a few more golden eggs, they both said, "Why not servants and a carriage? And there's that dowry for our beloved daughter's marriage." Soon the golden eggs could hardly keep pace with the couple's galloping desires. They became rapacious, and they gave themselves airs. "We must have money," was the wife's cry. "Put pepper in the goose's mash. Perhaps it will then lay 2 eggs at a time." "I need a new costume." Then one day the wife nudged her man with a terrible gleam in her eye. "Cut it open," she said. "It's an enormous bird and full of gold." "I can't," he said. So she put in his hands a knife. "Go on," she said. "I owe the dressmaker, the hairdresser, the grocery, the chemist, the wine shop, the jeweler. We simply must have more money. Or do you want me to borrow?" "All right," he said. "But it's a damnable." So he laid the goose on the kitchen table, stunned it, and opened it up. Then he gave a great booming laugh, dismay unfunny. "My dear, you'll never guess," he said, and his tears of rage, frustration, and sorrow broke in like a flood. "There's nothing inside the goose but ordinary flesh and blood." Isn't that the case? So why is this here? Why are we talking about this goose? Because this is what we can do. We can actually kill the goose, kill our industry, kill our businesses, kill our capital, thinking, "Oh, they're greedy," but really, as we do kill the goose that lays the golden egg, we won't have the golden eggs anymore, will we? So Greed consumes the sources of prosperity. So pleasures placed upon business by public authorities and other groups and remind us of this. So we're paralleled by the rash eagerness of government that tries to extract more and more money from the producers of goods and wealth. So we put over-regulation on business, taxed away profits, government confiscating the capital that businesses have, private ownership being destroyed or greatly reduced by the state, and the losing their main sources of revenue. The state must take over or try to undo this harm. Once the businesses go bankrupt, the state must start taking over to produce goods, right? And few people want to see the government confiscate all private property or damage, and that's done to the market at this time. And they look as to help and make the nation and the citizens prosperous, so the businesses do. And what if the businesses weren't there? I always think of, in certain cities, where they had like Walmart and Targets in these cities, and then they took away, they said, we don't need to have our, we don't need to have our police force. We don't need to pay them. Let's get rid of them. And then basically they're getting rid and basically making their place more and more unsafe and having protests, in these areas. And suddenly it's not safe anymore. So the big grocery stores and stuff, they move out. Like, it's not safe here. We're moving out. And then they've killed the goose that lays their golden eggs. Huh? That's what I think. So public expenditures, taxes, fines, regulations, they all place heavy burdens upon businesses, and they can sink the economy into poverty. The average citizen remains unaware of these things sometimes, right? And so unaware that their foundation and their prosperity is actually crumbling. So when you go on here, it says, Deuteronomy says, thou shalt not muzzle the ox when he treadeth out the corn. And this is a principle that's repeated a few times in the New Testament, saying, we cannot expect American business to be healthy and motivated if they are deprived of the fruits of their labor, right? That's important. So let's go on here. All right. That's the goose that lays the golden eggs, basically saying we need to realize, that, our businesses, our agriculture businesses, commerce, factories, and such, there's a balance between, being over regulating them. When they disappear, what do we have left? There's no more goose that lays the golden eggs. So let's go over this last part. I'm going to finish up here, so hopefully we'll get done. So, okay, building on the moral foundation of economics. It says, there has never been a society or a nation without, let me just read it, what Karish Chambers said. There has never been a society or a nation without God, but in history is cluttered with a wreckage of nations that have become indifferent to God and died. When a nation becomes indifferent to God, what happens in history? That nation dies, is what he's saying. Pretty true. So some separate economies, or some separate economics from politics, right? So some like to take economics and say the two are not linked, but they're actually pretty inseparable. A sound economy cannot exist without a political state to protect it. And a political state cannot prosper without a sound economy to support it. So economy and politics are very much linked. The politics are going to affect our economy no matter what. Foolish politics interfere and lead us to poverty. And wise economics basically encourage and propel our society into prosperity. So it's how, our politics will go with our economy. When we have wise politicians, we'll have wise economy. So